I'm sure this is going to be a week that is just chock full of post-election analysis for most of us, and definitely for the folks that are here on the panel. But I am just grateful that it is going to be so much more fun than last cycle. I'm LANAE ERICKSON. I'm the Vice President of Social Policy and Politics at Third Way, and thank you for joining us. If you are joining us on the live stream or you want to tweet from the audience, we are going to be using the hashtag 2020wave in hopes that we can continue this through the next cycle. So I'm very excited to have three guests with me here on the panel that are people that between them I think could fill an entire encyclopedia set of knowledge about how to win races across the country. But before we jump into that, I want to just give you a couple of insights that we got from a election eve poll that we conducted at Third Way with David Binder Research. So we talked to folks in the 72 battleground districts that Cook had called the battleground. The days before the election, either people that had already voted or people who said they were certain to vote. And we asked them about a couple of things. We said, what do you want Congress to prioritize coming into this next Congress? The number one answer was reducing health care costs. The second was expanding access to health care. And then we had fixing the immigration system and creating good paying jobs coming in behind that. 51% of the voters in these congressional districts said that health care was the top issue in deciding their vote. And I think often people say that Democrats aren't particularly good at sticking on message, but boy did they stick on message this year. When we asked folks what they had heard from those Democrats in their district, we asked them the named candidate, what did you hear coming out of their mouth? And then we made a word cloud of those open-ended responses, and it just said health care across the. So it's very clear what Democrats' message was this time, and interested to hear the panelists' thoughts on how that will continue to play out. We also wanted to know some of the implications for 2020, because we know that that race starts approximately right now to figure out who is going to get to go up against Donald Trump in 2020 for the Democrats. We know that a lot of mainstream and moderate candidates prevailed in this cycle. The new Democrat PAC won 86% of the races it endorsed in its primary, and it ended up flipping 27 seats. So we asked the Democrats and the independents in these battleground districts, what did you think about the ideology of the candidate? Was it about matched with where you wanted it to be? Would you like it to be more conservative, more liberal, or more moderate? And most of people said they liked the candidate they got. Right behind that, people said they wanted it to be more moderate, but only 16% of our sample said that they wanted their candidate to be more liberal. So interesting to think about what that means for 2020, and that was just of the Democrats and independents. And then finally, we asked them, what should the party do going forward? How should the Democratic Party win elections? And 70% said to win future elections, the party should appeal to a broad range of voters, including people who may have voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Only 17% said the party should move to the left to generate enthusiasm and increase participation among progressives and liberals. So interesting thoughts as we now go into the next election cycle. But that's enough data for your morning. Let's jump into conversation. I have three great people here today, so I'll start immediately to my left. We have Congressman Gregory Meeks from New York's 5th District. He is the chair of the CBC PAC and a member of the forward-thinking pro-growth New Democrat Coalition. He's been a member since 1998 and represents one of the most diverse constituencies in the nation. He's also a senior member of the House Financial Services and Foreign Affairs Committee. Right next to him, we have Emily Cain, who is the executive director of Emily's List, who I can say is one of the biggest powerhouses this cycle. My favorite stat that I kept quoting people who were depressed in December last year was from Emily's List, because in the previous cycle, they had their best year ever in the 2016 cycle. They had 920 women call them and say, I want to run for office. This cycle, they've had more than 42,000. Yeah, that's a lot. So Democrats needed 23 seats to flip the House, and Emily's List candidates delivered 23 flipped seats this cycle. So I think Emily can fairly say that she flipped the House. Well, Emily's List women did. And finally, we have Mark Putnam, who is the founding partner of Putnam Partners and one of the Democratic Party's most talented ad makers. He did the ad, you'll remember, in the 2016 cycle with Jason Kander, talking about his support for background checks while assembling an AR-15 blindfolded. He also did some very memorable ads this cycle, notably for Amy McGrath with the fighter jet, and his firm produced an ad that Hamilton's Lin-Manuel Miranda called the best political ad anyone's ever seen. So that's pretty good. So I'll start with you, Congressman Meeks. I just want to talk about the House for a bit. I know all eyes were on the House, and we're now going to have the most diverse Democratic caucus coming in history, and we're going to have one of the biggest, if not the biggest, new Democrat coalitions in history. What do you credit their success to?
I think it's candidates that fit and come from the districts. They lived the districts, so they could feel the everyday needs of the community, and they were able to articulate that better than anyone else because they talked to their neighbors. Many of them had not even run for public office before, but it's their life work that they related to their neighbors, and I saw that their neighbors, therefore, were volunteering on the streets. They were working door to door. It wasn't about all of the TV ads, although there was a lot of them. But people were going door to door asking their neighbors to make sure that they went out to vote, and they were able to articulate the facts that was going around them on a day-to-day basis. And I traveled around the country, and I was just amazed about that. And the best fundraisers were fundraisers in individuals' homes. It wasn't these other fundraisers, but they were going inside people's homes from house to house to house to have fundraisers, raising from their neighbors and talking about issues that people could relate to. And I think that made a tremendous difference, the quality of the candidates that we had across the board.
Yeah. Emily and Mark, what was a red thread that you saw that kind of adds to that in terms of the successes?
Well, I'll build on what the congressman said. I agree completely. It wasn't just that they were first-time candidates in many cases, and in most cases, quite frankly, but it was that they ran unapologetically as themselves. They told very personal stories. Your stats about health care are surprising to no one who paid attention to this election, but they weren't out there talking just about policies or specifically what they wanted to do when they got elected. They were telling personal stories about pre-existing conditions, about caring for loved ones with cancer, about sick kids and the challenges they had navigating those issues. And they were not afraid to make it personal when taking on incumbent Republicans who, quite frankly, I think hit a new low this cycle when they just blatantly started lying in the last few weeks, particularly about pre-existing conditions. It really showed the difference between the kinds of campaigns and the kinds of campaigns here.
And I would add to that. First, I do agree with the congressman. A candidate has to reflect the district. They have to be of the district and understand their district or their state. That's vital. I will say that if we're doing our job correctly on the television advertising side, Congressman, we need to show that in our advertising.
That's exactly right.
And we have to show that these candidates are connecting on issues as well as just on their character and their story. I would also just say about this election that it really was a story of a suburban wave. I don't know if it was a blue tidal wave. It was definitely a blue wave, and it was mostly a suburban wave in places that we were winning, like Charleston, like Oklahoma City, like places that we were involved in Northern Virginia with Jennifer Wexton and Elaine Luria and Chrissy Houlihan in Pennsylvania suburbs and outside of Philadelphia. These were stories of women candidates largely, but also just men candidates like Dean Phillips in Minnesota against Eric Paulson. There's a suburban wave where people wanted to see a candidate willing to work with both sides, willing to be focused on solutions rather than partisanship and demonizing the opponent. And in race after race after race, we saw that be successful.
If you had to pick one race that you just really love to tell the story of that you think epitomizes what Democrats did successfully and what they need to continue to do, what would it be?
Well, for me, one race would be in Illinois, Lauren Underwood. 30 years old.
I was going to say.
Just absolutely magnificent what she did and how she did it. Just focused, a nurse, 30 years old, and had never ran, and just said, I'm going to do this. And related to people and gave her story and talked about how she lived in that district. And I was just amazed at what she did and how she did it and the victory that took place. So Lauren Underwood in Illinois, that was huge for me.
Well, I was going to say that one, but since you already did, I'll jump to one of the Virginia races and talk about Abigail Spanberger, a race that was, I think, people weren't sure of right up until the end, but the difference was made because of who she was. Having been former CIA, a Girl Scout troop leader and mom who ran again as unapologetically as herself and really took on every attack that came her way, again, unapologetically. If you haven't seen the closing of the debate she had, where she said, I am not Nancy Pelosi, my name is Abigail Spanberger. And it was really impressive how she was able to make it again personal, but also raise the funds and run the kind of campaign that made her able to reflect the professionalism in her ads and in her ground game that reflected who she was personally as well.
And if folks don't know, that district is where David Brat really started the Tea Party revolution in taking out Eric Cantor, and now it's represented by Abigail Spanberger.
So you're asking me to pick my favorite child. As a father, I don't want to do that, and they're not my children, but they are certainly my clients and my friends. I have too many races I could point to, honestly. I look at Jennifer Wexton here in Virginia 10 as a race where she was disciplined and went through a tough primary. I mean, the thing we're not really talking about is how many Democrats came out to run for office in the primaries and really were healthy contests of ideas and passion. And Jennifer survived a tough primary and then went on to defeat Barbara Comstock in a very decisive victory. It was exciting for us for it to be the first victory of the evening for a flip seat. And that was a race won in the suburbs on the issue of health care and also on her own personal story as a mom. So if I had to pick one, I would probably go with the first one that was announced for us, which was Jennifer, and she's going to be a phenomenal congresswoman.
Let's talk about those primaries, because I know it had a little bit of a Hunger Games feeling at certain points, with some of the districts having 8 or 9 Democrats saying, I'd like to run. And at one point I said, every 30-something brunette woman I know that used to work at the Department of State has gone to go run for Congress somewhere. So, that turned out to be true. So what did you folks see as kind of crucial to the success of the people that came through the primaries, and what might that tell us about where we're going in 2020? Go ahead.
Well, Emily's list is very aggressively involved in primaries. We are unapologetically involved in primaries because our mission is to elect pro-choice Democratic women. And what we saw was that we had one of the best records of any of the organizations during the primary season for getting our women through. But that's a testament to them and to the campaigns they ran. And I will say these women who stepped up to run, again, the themes being largely first-time candidates, people with a personal reason, people who, after 2016, felt down like the rest of us, came to the Women's March maybe, or a local Women's March, found a little bit more of their voice. Some of them showed up at the Emily's List training the day after the Women's March, like Lauren Underwood and Chrissy Houlihan, and kept saying, I want to do more, and weren't necessarily getting to running for office. But then, as those dots began to get connected, and finally you see the Republicans take on an anti-woman agenda, an anti-healthcare agenda, you just saw women say, I can't sit by anymore, I'm doing this. And I think that determination is what really helped them plow through those very difficult primaries, because they were. I mean, those primaries got pretty nasty at different times. They sort of tended to want to pit different parts of the Democratic Party together. But I think the candidates that were successful, particularly our women, were the ones who were able to build the coalitions across the ideology in the Democratic Party, who had the money to back it up, so they could run the kind of campaigns they needed to win.
And I would add to that in the primaries, I think if we made one ad that mentioned Donald Trump, and there was a sort of a divide between the candidates that wanted to be the first in the anti-Trump caucus versus the candidates that really wanted to talk about how you solve problems, like in the case of Jennifer Wexton, how you reach across party lines as a state legislator to get things done. And Democrats do value experience. They do value people that have been through the legislative process, understand how to get things done. And so that was a divide that we saw in many of our races. It wasn't just who can decry Donald Trump the loudest, but it was who can actually reach across party lines to get things done in spite of Donald Trump.
I think that's absolutely correct. Again, it's people speaking to folks in their communities. And so what they said was basically, not only can we win a primary, and they convinced their folks, the primary voters, not only could they win a primary, but they can win a general election, because that's what's important. You know, you don't want to just win a battle and lose the war. They were saying that they are the perfect candidate to win this primary, but then also win an election, because otherwise you don't get to accomplish or change the things that you had to do. And so the folks were not just talking about Donald Trump, you know, although he gave some inspiration in saying that, what do you got to lose? For example, a lot of the African-American candidates, et cetera, what do you got to lose? And they went out to articulate health care, you got to lose, which resonate over everyone. You know, we don't have an infrastructure to create the kinds of jobs that goes through everyone. You know, basically what your poll showed, that's exactly what these individuals talked about and said, I can win and I can help make that change.
I will say we also saw that in the governor's races across the country, with Janet Mills in Maine, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, Michelle Lujan Grisham in New Mexico, again, running on their experience, running on actually getting things done, running as themselves, and I think that played out across the country in the races we saw flip at the statewide level as well.
We often say Democratic primary voters vote like pundits. And that was true in the poll, too. We asked them, would you rather have someone who mirrored your policy preferences or someone who can beat Donald Trump? And overwhelmingly, people picked the latter. So, Emily, you mentioned a little bit about the Republicans this cycle. There was another party. They were involved as well. What did you see? What did all of you see this cycle that you think is kind of a harbinger of what's to come? What was new? And then, you know, what can we take from that for what we need to be prepared for going forward from the Republicans?
Well, I would start with saying they really fell into this trap of language that was driven by hate and divisiveness, and they clung to it. And I think it of course comes from the top, but they were extra aggressive, it felt like to me, as we looked at all the races across the country. The ads that were just blatant lies, the ad about healthcare in particular, not just about their own positions, but about their opponents. I was in Iowa with Abby Finkenauer a few weeks ago as she was coming into the home stretch. The ads that were running against her that were just blatant lies about healthcare and about women's healthcare were shocking and appalling. I think the hope would be the Republicans would take a look at how badly they did where they ran these ads, because they lost in Abby's race and in other places across the country. But my fear is, my guess, where we see no letting up at the top, we will see more of that hate-based, divisive, racially charged, socioeconomically charged language that I think will be problematic for them, I hope, as we head to 2020.
Go ahead, Congressman.
No, I just wanted to add on to that. Number one, I think the reverse happened. Our message was crisp and simple. You know, generally we have a message that you've got to, you know, it's a 20-page thesis that you have to read to figure out what our message was.
We have a white paper.
That's right. Not this time. It was crisp and it was simple. And I think that was tremendously important. And I think that Emily is exactly right, too, that, you know, and I think one of the untold stories of this election is what makes me proud of America, to be quite frank with you, is I saw people of all ethnicities coming together. As quiet as it's kept, there's 9 new Congressional Black Caucus members. Most of them come from districts that there's very few African Americans in them.
That's right.
So people were coming together in America to refute the hard, racist catcalling of the president. And that really gives me, moving forward in 2020, as you're talking about, a great deal of hope, and saying that my country is going to stand up and is going to make sure that we come together and not separate us. And I think that's what's happened in a lot of these districts that we won. People of all lifestyles were coming together.
Yeah. If you look at the Lucy McBath race, she won a place that we all tried really hard to win in the special, but no amount of money could put John Ossoff over the top, and here we now have Congresswoman Lucy McBath.
Prime example.
Exactly. I wanted to back up one more thing on what we saw in the Republican advertising. When they didn't have anything to repair to in terms of their own record to defend, they really did lie in a way that I've never seen before. And I attribute that to, frankly, the dying of newspapers, the lack of political coverage by correspondents, the lack of ad watches and fact checks. Most of the time when we wanted to refute an attack that was completely untrue, we saw this with Michelle Lujan Grisham, attacks that were completely false. Same thing with Dean Phillips in Minnesota. Complete fabrications. we didn't have ad watches in many of these districts to fall back on, except with Dean Phillips. They had a very healthy television news corps that did run a lot of stories that we could then put into television advertising saying it was outright false. We don't have that luxury in a lot of races. So I think that as Democrats, we just have to be prepared for this, know that our side doesn't use those sort of tactics. The other side is going to do whatever they can to win a seat, and we just have to be prepared for that.
Yeah. That's a nice shout out to my home state of Minnesota, which does many, many things better than everyone else. So there were some, I think, surprising results that, both in a positive and a negative way, that I was a little surprised by on Tuesday night and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday as things continued to come in. What was the biggest surprise for each of you?
Biggest surprise. Well, I would say on the House side in New York, some of the polls were starting to change, and we were getting nervous, and some folks had written off Max Rose. You look at that district and how it was, and then when we were watching the results roll in, and we saw that Max Rose, who we were counting on trying to get 3, but quite honest, we didn't think Max Rose was going to be one of them. And he came through in a very big way, and you look at that turnout. So that was a surprise to me. I didn't expect to get Max Rose.
Well, is it bad to say it's hard to be surprised anymore? I mean, I feel
surprised all the time.
Well,
so I
guess maybe my level for shock has changed in the past couple of years. But what I will say is, on election night at Emily's List. So back in March, our fearless leader Stephanie Shryock told us that she had made a commitment to Leader Pelosi that she wanted to flip the House with 23 pro-choice Democratic women. And she came back to the office to tell me that, and I said, well, we should gather the team to make sure we know what we're doing. And we have that focus every single day, since the spring. And when we were able to do that and deliver that, and we still have 3 more outstanding that could come in the next few days. We just picked up Senator-elect Kyrsten Sinema last night. I would say is that this wave was not isolated. Well, it was largely, there was a lot of suburban areas for sure. It was not isolated to one part of the country. It was not one community's story. It was everybody's story. And I think that's a reflection of what's happened in the last couple of years that really started post-2016, then the Women's March, and it just kept going from there. People started making calls. People started marching. People started sending letters. They rallied after hurricanes. They rallied after Parkland. So I think the surprise maybe wasn't a shock and awe on election night, but really that over the last 2 years that this has not let up. And that's why at Emily's List, when we talk about what happened last week, we don't just think of it as a wave. A wave feels temporary. We really do think of it as a sea change for women in politics, and I think for Democrats in politics, as to how we conduct ourselves, how we win elections, who are our leaders, and what they look like.
I guess I would point to 2 losses as being surprising. I was in the camp that thought we were going to see a bigger wave than we ultimately did, because I thought that someone like Andrew Gillum in Florida could have been carried to victory by a bigger wave. I was expecting that. I thought he would win. Richard Cordray in Ohio, same thing. I think Ohio's, despite Senator Brown's victory, is becoming much more conservative and is a harder place for Democrats to win. So those were surprises. Cordray was predicted to win that race. And so I would look at those as slight surprises. But then there were over performances. Places like Georgia with Stacey Abrams and Beto in Texas were encouraging surprises, just to see the Democratic base get mobilized as strongly as they were.
Yeah. So what do you think that Democrats haven't figured out yet based on this election cycle? I know we had a lot of improvements since the last one, but what are we still struggling with? And maybe Ohio is a piece of that. I don't know, but surely we haven't completely figured it out. What do we need to really focus on doing between now and the next time we have to go to the ballot?
I guess first I think we need to figure out what is our message as a party. Are we anti-Trump, or are we going to give a different alternative direction for the country, a positive direction? And that's something that we'll be seeing wrestled with in the primaries to come for president. I also just think we as a party still have to figure out how we're going to address Donald Trump on a daily basis, because it's a new outrage literally every 3 hours. And so we as a party have to sharpen our pencils on how we're going to really counter that without getting down in the mud with him, because that's what he wants, and that's not what the voters want. We've seen that pretty clearly.
I would say, thinking about 2020, I think Democrats have to remember to be united around the fact that we all agree that Donald Trump needs to go. But that after that, we also within the party have to recognize, and looking at the wins and the messages of who won and what they were saying, is that they were reflective of their district. To go back to the Congressman's first point, that it can't be about being one kind of Democrat that is all the same all across the country. In these women, these 33 brand new women that we are adding to the House so far from Emily's list, what is the most important thing in their district? Maybe they're all healthcare, but how they talk about it and why it's important is different, right? And if you ask them all to rank their top 5 issues, they're all going to say a different set of 5. It's a matter of making sure we allow them to be the best representatives from their districts and be Democrats at the same time, because that should be able to happen. And I think that we see, and I see an opportunity with this new crop of members in the House in particular to lead by example as to not only how to win races in tough places, but also how to serve in a way that is reflective of how you ran.
And I couldn't agree with that more. I think that's what our challenge is going to be over the next 2 years, to make sure that all of our voices are heard and the issues that are important to us. Too often, for example, when we are having issues in Democratic conference or caucus, you only hear one voice, and the other voice does not come. And I think that all of those voices have to be heard. And then we've got to learn how, the key to me in politics is how do you compromise. Don't, without folks saying, oh, you're not 100% pure this or that. How do you compromise so that someone who comes from New York City like I do can get some of the things that I think I need in my urban district with someone that's coming from Georgia that is in a completely different kind of district than what I live in. So how do we fit this in and weave these in so that we can then put forward an agenda and that the American people can see across the board that they have a real interest that's taking place therein. Now, I do believe they want us not to be focused simply on Donald Trump and leave all the other issues beside, because that's not going to change their life. They're concerned about their future. They're concerned about their health care, their children, their families, their jobs. And so there's ways of which that we can work to get that done. And I think one of the examples that shows that is, quite frankly, and we didn't get it straight then, is the Affordable Care Act. Who would have thought that, going back to what took place in the midterms in 2010, that the deciding issue and the number one issue would be health care. And if you look at the Affordable Care Act, it was not all that everybody that from the left wanted, and it wasn't all that folks from the right wanted, et cetera. It kind of, because people were, ambivalent, can we do this? But it was the kind of thing that you could get past. You got something done. And it came home to be the number one issue to help us, because it's something that resonated throughout everybody. When you work together like that, you can come up with something that's good for the American people.
Yeah. Emily, you mentioned Parkland, and we were talking about Lucy McBath. It feels to me, as somebody who really studies the social issues and how they're playing out, like the politics of guns have really shifted this cycle. Do you think that's true? And how different does it feel now in terms of, running against the NRA versus, 4 or 5 years ago?
Again, I think that goes back to what I was saying before. It really is a district-by-district conversation. I come unapologetically from northern Maine, right? It's where I live. It's where I came from very early this morning. And it's a very different conversation there about gun ownership than it is in some other parts of the country. But I think we have 2 examples this cycle. One in Lucy McBath and the other in Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, who won in Florida, both who very publicly talked about gun violence and the impact it had on their lives and their families as part of the reason that they were the right person to serve those communities. And so I think also making it personal, they weren't running because of the NRA. They were running because their lives had been impacted tragically by gun violence. And I think that's a very different way to tell the story that reaches more people and is certainly less threatening to responsible gun owners around the country.
Yeah. Mark, does that feel different to you as somebody who I'm sure has had to deal with these attacks over the last few years?
I really agree with everything Emily said. The issue of guns is a very cultural issue that really depends upon where you're running. And for Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, I mean, she was a very strong proponent of the Second Amendment, and it was something actually in North Dakota, the voters just assumed, well, you better be good on that issue. We're going to end up judging on other things. So we didn't endure any attacks on guns in North Dakota, but it really is a state-by-state issue, and you feel like the ground is shifting on it, and then suddenly you're reminded that no, in some places it really hasn't.
So Democrats are now going to have this very big new class, and we know after a wave, one of the hardest things they have to do is defend those seats that are now in some pretty red areas. So what advice, we'll start with you, Congressman Meeks, what advice would you have for these folks that just got elected who know that they have to run again in those tough districts in 2 years?
Continue to be yourself. Don't let Washington change you. Don't let, the fact that you're here, and be yourself. Tell your same stories to members of Congress in conference here, and then go back home and stay home and let them know what you're doing and how you're doing it. I also say, once you're a member, the key, I know for me, is having a great staff, making sure that you've got people on the ground still in your office. Washington is great, but all politics is local. Don't get caught up into the hullabaloo of D.C. Stay home, stay focused on the people that elected you, and they then will continue to support you, and make sure that you have that open chain of communication. Don't just drop your campaign style, because you're still running. And make sure you're staying in contact. You get here when you're voting, when you're out, get back home and make all the community meetings and report back to them exactly what you're doing in Washington, D.C. And I think they will reward you for that and reelect you.
Yeah. This is something we think about a lot at Emily's list because not only did we have the success at the federal level and the gubernatorial level, but also we helped elect more than 280 new state legislators across the country and 20 down-ballot statewide races. And quite frankly, the advice is the same for all of them, which is remember where you came from, talk to your constituents, be present, show up and talk to the people who disagreed with you and didn't support you. Get to know them and understand who they are and how they feel so that you can then carry their message. You're their member of Congress too. I will also say for us, I was shocked, and I was in 11 states in the last 6 weeks, and everywhere I went, the offices were bursting literally with volunteers. They had to move canvas trainings outside in some places because they didn't have enough room for them in their offices. You need to keep those people engaged. Those people showed up for you. You need to make sure you keep in touch with them and give them ways to help between now and the next election. But that this is a journey that you're on together with your constituents and with your volunteers and your staff. And it's important to keep the team together, if you will, every step of the way.
The last panel I did like this, Emmanuel Cleaver and Susan Del Bene said, a good politician when, if they walk into a room, they find the person that disagrees with them, and that's who they go and talk to.
Yeah. I would say, is this still on? It died.
Yeah.
Now it's on. I would say that first off, to echo what the Congressman was saying, you got to know your district, and you got to your constituent services has to be top notch. That's the first thing. You got to do your job and make sure you're there for everybody, no matter what party stripe they come in the door with, that you're going to help them out. Second, Dean Phillips in Minnesota, his whole slogan was, it's a conversation and everyone's invited. That you got to be welcoming all voices and make sure that everybody has a voice in democracy. It's something Eric Paulson had stopped doing many years ago. He'd stopped holding town meetings. It was impossible to ever really talk to him. So be accessible and open. The last thing I would say to those folks who are coming from purple to more red districts is you got to find places where you disagree with leadership that you can, with a good conscience, vote the way your district wants, even if you have a lot of pressure from the National Party leadership. And that's a hard thing to do. But you saw it with Kirsten Sinema in Arizona. She ran towards the center. She wasn't left of center. She wasn't left of center. She wasn't, she was right there. She did a good job of reflecting the values of Arizona in a state that is changing. It's becoming more purple. But she was able to point to places where she did agree with Republicans and worked with them, and a lot of places where she agreed with Democrats. And I think that that's a good model for somebody who's in a tough-to-win district.
I want to add one other thing, because it's important that you also continue to focus on the non-traditional voter. We had a high turnout for midterm elections. Some of those folks that came out for the first time. and you've got to stay in contact with them because you want them to come out the second time also. You know, and generally, I know in many campaigns, the way that incumbents used to do is just you work on what we call the triple prime voter, the person that have come out to vote for 3 primaries in a row because you know that person is going to come out to vote. Well, you want that person to continue to come out to vote. But one of the things that I think made a difference here are non-traditional voters who came out to vote. And you want to keep them engaged. You want to make sure that they don't get a feel that, well, I voted this time, it doesn't make a difference, so I'll never come back out again. So I say that to the candidates that won and to the candidates like myself who've been there for a while, we better start focusing on that non-traditional voter and make sure that we keep them engaged as voters.
So the blue wave definitely, you know, happened in the House. It happened across the country in governor's races and state legislative races. But we did have some more struggles in the Senate. How do you explain kind of the divergence in where those two storylines went? Even though the Senate storyline is slightly less depressing than it was a few days ago, you know, it's still a tough place for Democrats and you know, a little bit discordant with what we saw in so many other places.
Well, let's see how long my microphone lasts. First off, we had some very difficult seats to defend. Missouri and Indiana, both senators were helped in their reelection bid 6 years ago by running against deeply flawed Republicans that, frankly, in this environment, I don't know if they might stand a little better chance than they did 6 years ago, given the president. Also, there's just a red wall. I mean, we saw this in North Dakota with Heidi Heitkamp, which was a really hard loss. But it was uphill for a long time. We had to get double the number of Republican votes that we did 6 years ago in order to win because the state had really shifted into being a very hard Republican state. It's much more like Utah now than it is like South Dakota. So that was a reality that we had to deal with in 2018. The map is a lot more favorable towards us in 2020. It's a presidential year. A lot more of our vote will also come out, so that'll be to our benefit.
I also just want to say, I think Mark's earlier point about the increased Democratic turnout in states even where we weren't successful is a sign that everything that happened was not all bad. I think that gives us hope as we head towards 2020, that even where we did have these tough losses, Claire was certainly a really tough loss for the people in our community in Emily's list, but that we can look at the groundswell of new voters, as the congressman said, as we head towards 2020 and hopefully learn some lessons about where we need to do more to double down and engage those people at an even higher level.
And I think that, and Claire was that hurts. So there's no denying that. But I do look at where there are now opportunities. I mean, if you had told me 4 years ago that Stacey Abrams will come within a percentage point of winning Georgia, or Gillum would come within a percentage point of winning Florida, or that Beto O'Rourke would be really, challenging and giving Cruz the run of his life, I would have said, no way. Those races would not even be close at all. So to see how close we've come in a short period of time gives me encouragement that 2020 will be different senatorially, and as indicated, it's going to be the reverse. It's going to be some of the Republicans now who are in Democratic states having to defend those states. And so I'm really encouraged by what I saw overall in this election. And I think, and I say this too, especially in Georgia and Florida, where you saw folks fighting to prevent individuals from voting. Voter suppression, people getting kicked off the rolls. I think that, and then by these elections being so close, people are going to be more determined to make sure that they're registered to vote, to make sure that they go out to vote. And so a number of those people who did not vote or were thrown off the rolls, they'll be on the rolls this time. And lastly, in Florida, it was huge to show that the resolution number 4 passed, so that individuals who had been convicted of a crime and did their time, etc., they will be able to go back to vote, and they say that's about 1 million people, which would have made clearly a big difference in the Florida election. So I'm encouraged.
Well, and also some of these states, as you talk about the red wall, they're not exactly the states that we necessarily would think about winning in a presidential election. And Democrats did quite well in a lot of those Midwestern states that we maybe thought were a blue wall last time that didn't quite hold up. So,
well, and if you think about like Tammy Baldwin, if we were having this conversation 18 to 20 months ago, we would all be saying, oh, Tammy Baldwin is in so much trouble. Yeah. They spent so much money trying to defeat her, but ultimately couldn't come up with a candidate to run against her that would match the dollars they invested to tear her down. When I was with her weekend before the election, she said, I had to figure out how to run against a super PAC as my opponent for so long, because that's who was coming at her, not another person. And I think there are lessons to be learned there about how she ran and how she started, because in the end, she was called the minute the polls closed on election night, and it was good.
Absolutely. I'll ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the folks here in the live audience, so get your questions ready. I have a spreadsheet of at least 35 people that have said they might be running for president in 2020. I'm sure that by next week that list will grow. It's a continuously growing spreadsheet. I may have to have several pages of it very soon. But what is, if you had to give one kind of a lesson learned from these midterms for those many folks who are now going to jump into the fray to go up against Donald Trump, what would it be?
I would say don't just run against Donald Trump. That you have to be. You can't just say no to him. It has to be, not that, but this, and here's why, and try to bring more of of course, a fierce determination to defeat him, but also something that actually brings those voters that voted for Trump last time, that voted for Democrats this time, to the table, and keeps them there, gives them some ownership of that election, and also try to bring Democrats together. Don't spend the primary trying to divide us into different camps of Democrats, because that will only make it harder for us to come together. We have to wake up every day and remember we all don't want him to be president anymore. That is a unifier that should withstand any test of time, I hope. And so that I think it's incumbent on the candidates to run the kind of campaign that is for the good of the order, keeps it focused on that, but also keeps those new voters engaged.
Go ahead.
Okay, I have to turn that on again. I would add to that first, I want to look back at 2016 for some of the best lessons of how we can do a better job in 2020. That it's hard to draw a lot of parallels between a midterm election that we won largely at the congressional level to a presidential process. Presidential elections are a beast unto themselves. They're really unlike anything else. But so first I would look at 2016. And as Democrats, we had to do a better job at talking to working class voters. And I don't mean just white working class. I mean all working class voters. And we saw some failings on that level in 2016 that I saw the process of fixing that in 2018. That we were talking about issues that were important to them with health care, with job security, with Social Security and Medicare, some of these bedrock foundations of the Democratic Party that are how we make sure people are looked out for and taken care of, but also empowered. And so I think that as we look to 2020, I couldn't agree more. It can't just be anti-Trump. It has to be a positive vision for America that is rooted in what does the working class of this country, what are they looking for in their leaders?
And you got to be able to keep it simple. Mm-hmm. That is tremendously important. I mean, one of the things that I know was said to me when I was initially running is, if you got to explain it, you're in trouble. If you got to explain your message, you're in trouble. It's got to be kept simple, and it's got to be something that can touch America no matter what the region is. You got to figure out something that works together. And I think that, when I think about the past presidential election, the last two, there are 30%, 35% of individuals that, and I think Donald Trump is correct in this, he says that he could shoot somebody in the middle of Times Square and they would still vote for him. That's there. But there are 15 to 20% of individuals who voted for Donald Trump who actually voted for Barack Obama twice. So it's got to be someone that can speak to them. Mm-hmm. Because that's what wins the election. That 15%, to sway them toward, to come back to us, the independents. to make sure that they vote, for the candidate. And that's the same kind of thing that happened in our primary. We want to make sure that we can elect someone that's going to be able to speak to the issues, as indicated, that affects all Americans, and can do it in a simplified way that they understand because of the story that they've had. I think about, and they want someone that's inspirational. Americans love an inspirational leader. Barack Obama and his whole campaign, it was inspirational. Think about even Bill Clinton, a kid from hope. That's what he talked about. And you can even go to the Republican side. That's what Ronald Reagan really was all about. It was about giving folks inspiration. So you've got to have someone that can talk common sense in an inspirational way. It can't be, I think you got to combine those two so that Americans and they believe, I can believe in this person, that he's going to make my life better, or her, or she's going to make my life better. I think that's important.
I've heard people say Republicans can win on fear, but Democrats have to win on hope.
That's right.
So let's open it up to questions from the audience, and I will ask you to just say your name, and if you have an organization, identify yourself. And we have a microphone coming around, so wait until it gets towards you and before you start speaking. Let's start over here. Wait 1 second until she gets to you. There you go.
My name is Richard Goodstein. I have my own consulting firm. It's a question really for Emily. We're talking 2020, looking back at 2016. How much of what happened to Hillary Clinton was rank gender bias versus specific to her? Because obviously there's a lot riding on the answer to that question, because we have all these Democratic women who are talking about running for president. And I think it's the case that the vote among black and Hispanic men for Trump was uncommonly high in 2016. Tell me if I'm wrong. And if so, again, was there any kind of gender issue that came to the fore that Democrats just can't ignore in 2020?
Well, I think that the general point of gender and sexism playing a role is undeniable. And I think it certainly is driven, there certainly is a media element to it that plays out on the day-to-day basis when we see even our House candidates at this cycle, how they were covered. We're still talking about how they sound, how they dress, how they feel, are they warm, right? And I would argue, to the Congressman's point, that Hillary Clinton was inspirational also to millions of Americans. But when it came to the fear that was out there in the end, it wasn't able to, Donald Trump came out on top. So as we look towards 2020, I think what's refreshing is that we're talking about multiple women who might run for president. My list started back in, I guess, July. I had 4 women, and I stopped at 25 men. It would have to be larger now. But I think the difference is it's not a surprise that we might see a woman this time. I think these women who are contemplating it, all senators, are bringing each their own kind of personality that's going to do some of the things we were just talking about, bringing together the party in different ways, bringing together coalitions, bringing together people from different kinds of backgrounds together to hopefully put together a winning coalition. But I don't think sexism is going to go away at all. I think we're going to see the Republicans double down on it if there are 2018 campaigns were any indicator, and it's something that as a party we're going to have to be ready to not only stomach but also defend. I think in 2016 we didn't always know how to parse out sexism from people who just wanted to talk about Hillary Clinton, right? And we're going to have to get better at that as we head into 2020, how we prevent it, how we respond to it, and ultimately how we overcome it.
I did want to just say, though, in my number one, and I agree with you, Hillary was inspirational, but I was surprised, and I think that we've got to get better in that, because still in that election, I think some of it was a backlash against Obama to a degree, and I think that took place. But when I looked at the numbers, and you can correct me at that point, the most surprising thing of the 2016 election to me was that overall, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, when I would have thought that never could have happened, that they would have stood up bigger than that, because here was an opportunity to elect, because that was my whole thing. This whole America is so great, we're going to elect our first African-American president, and right behind it, our first woman president. And for me to see 53% of white women did not vote because they could have shut this thing down was really surprising, and I don't think that will happen again.
Mark, anything to add on sexism?
I've been encouraged. I work for Governor Raimondo in Rhode Island. It's encouraging to see Governor-elect Whitmer in Michigan, to see Stacey Abrams do as well as she did with both supposedly a gender bias as well as a racial bias against an African-American woman. She ran a very strong campaign. So I am constantly encouraged. Women do have to do everything perfectly in a campaign. They can never show anger. They have to be perfectly put together. They are held to a higher standard than male candidates are every day of their lives, and it's not just candidates. It's every woman speaks about these challenges that they face, that they have to be perfect all the time. It's true in politics. They do have to hit their marks and always be cool. But we are seeing great successes, and couldn't be more proud of Governor Raimondo. She won an overwhelming re-election victory in what is a tough state to win for any Democrat to ever get over 50%. Hasn't happened for a Democrat in decades. So I'm encouraged. That's what I would add to it.
Let's go right here, and we'll go right here.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lauren Gambino. I'm with The Guardian. I was just wondering if you were surprised by sort of the resilience of Trump's coalition at all, and looking at 2020, do you think, a lot of discussion in the primary has been around ideology, and I'm wondering how much you think sort of personality and posture and ability to take on Trump will be a factor, if that even might be more important than whether you come from one wing or the other?
Well, I come from Maine, home of Governor LePage, right? And he got elected in 2010, and people said that guy could never win, right? And he won. He won his first election with 39% of the vote. And the second time, they thought he could never get reelected, and he won with about 48% of the vote, right? And I think you look at Walker in Wisconsin, where he got reelected, and then we finally were able to defeat him with Tony Evers this past week. But the coalition, I mean, that base that Trump has is no different than these Tea Party governors that were elected in 2010, largely. It sticks together, and that's why the congressman's point about who are that 15 to 20% of people who are in that group that are willing to switch. That for one reason or another went that way in 10 or went that way in 14, but now they're coming back. But that's also a cautionary tale for Democrats, I think, for anybody who says, oh, this guy could never get reelected. You need to look at those 2010 governors that did get reelected in 14, because it can happen. Folks, we have to realize that we can't take for granted that somehow the outrageousness will not lead to a reelect, because we've shown time and again that base holds together.
Good morning. Something that was great about this election was we saw turnout in a way we've not seen before. One reporter said it's been the highest turnout since universal suffrage passed, which is incredible. But even more so, we saw turnout in places for Democrats that Hillary Clinton couldn't win in 2016. How do we avoid that apathy in 2020?
But one of the things, and I think one of the reasons that turnout was up, and I think that was substantial, was millennial turnout was substantially up. And that gives me encouragement, because, anytime I think of anything that has been successful as far as a movement is concerned, it's millennials, it's young people that does it, and they begin to participate. And the interest that I see that is happening now, I mean, I, for example, walked into a barbershop to get a haircut. And generally when you go in there, these young folks in there, they're talking sports or, something else. When I walked in, they didn't know who I was at the time. I tried to have my cap on, and I just wanted to sit, and I sat down and I just listened. I didn't say anything. And they were talking about politics. They were talking about what's going on in their communities. They were talking about, what they had aspirations for within their families, and the changes that they want to make. And to me, that means that they are locked in and engaged. It just wasn't an emotional come out to vote because of Donald Trump. It was, here's what we've got to do to make sure that our lives in the future is going to be better. And I think that's going to help. And I think that turnout is not just a one election, a one midterm election type of thing. It is something that you're going to see probably increase in 2020. That's going to be beneficial to us.
I want to add to that I've been saying that Democrats can't just run against Donald Trump. But let's also recognize President Trump has been a great recruiting tool for Democrats. To have less than 1,000 women reach out to Emily's list for the 2016 cycle and to have over 40,000 reach out for the 2018 cycle speaks to his power as a motivational factor for Democrats. I think then you see the same thing with the suburban women that really turned the tide in a lot of these races in 2018. They're motivated to come out and vote because of the actions of the president. The same thing in Alabama, which was a very unique circumstance, but that was a race that turned on women vote, people of color, and millennials, as the congressman said. So these are the blocks of vote that are highly motivated by the president, and that's not going to change in 2020. If anything, it's going to grow. That's why I'm encouraged about 2020.
Let's go right here.
Hi, my name is Bob Santamaria. I'm a policy student with Carnegie Mellon, and I'm wondering, on a daily basis, we had said, how do you deal with Donald Trump on a daily basis? So we've talked a bit about how you run against Donald Trump, or to the degree that you do that. On a daily basis, and this might be for the congressman more specifically, what's the most effective way to fight that message in a way that doesn't turn others off?
Well, what I do, and sometimes, in my district, I might be more aggressive than others. But when I even try to do that is what I say, especially if I'm on television or something of that nature and the issue comes up, and I'm likely to say that Donald Trump is a liar. I'm likely to say Donald Trump is a con man. But I'll say then, that's not me just saying that. Let's get the videotape. Ted Cruz said it. Marco Rubio said it. Mitt Romney said it. Even to a large degree, the soon-to-be former Speaker, Ryan, said it. And let's just talk facts and to try to do it in a non-emotional way and just show that we know who he is. Now, that's who he is, but now let me tell you what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to do to make your life better. And we want to keep him because I also talk about how the rest of the world, I give my experiences as a congressman, being on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I also talk about how other world leaders are looking at him and other people are looking at him and thereby looking at the American people. So it's important for us to show who we are as Americans. And here's what we will do. Back to the campaign theme again that took place, because health care was tremendously important. They scratched their heads and talking about, we mentioned guns. I'm finding, and I found in talking to a lot of individuals who are NRA members, who are gun owners, they want universal background checks, because guns are now becoming, in a lot of these communities, a health issue. When folks, and then you talk to suburban moms, they are scared with their children going to school, and they don't think that the answer to that is to bring more guns into school. And so you tie it to those things that I want to make sure that we're all safe in that regards. And here's how I think the best way we can get it done. The shooting that just took place in California. I got a kid that's in college. Now, my first thing that my wife said is, do we have to be concerned about our child going someplace with fun on a college night and somebody? No. So I think we can then share those experiences and continue to talk about it, and I think that makes a difference.
Mark and Emily, I know you both worked with people who have had to balance this. They have a strong base in their district or their state that wants to go against every single crazy thing Trump does every 3 hours, and then a bunch of people who think all of that's completely irrelevant to their lives. So how do you suggest that they navigate that?
Well, first, you just have to know why you're in office and what issues got you there, what character traits got you there, what is in your core for why you ran, and focus on that. You can get so easily distracted by the noise in Washington, and the president generates a lot of it. So instead, if you're able to focus on results, plow through that, not try to get distracted and take the bait on a daily, hourly basis from the president, but instead focus on results and why you were elected, that's going to help you make a case for re-election. Ultimately, you do have to answer to the voters, and you do have to put out a platform of why you deserve re-election, and that's more important than whether you won a Twitter war.
I would only build on that to say this is a marathon and not a sprint. And every day that we get sucked into the drama of the morning tweet session, we have to acknowledge it. But every day that we're sucked in is energy we could be spending doing something else. And I think that is going to be the challenge of the new Congress in a way that is unique, because they have the Republican Senate, the Democratic House. They're going to want to and need to find things they can actually do, so you can go home to the barbershop and talk about also what you did, right? Particularly on things that we should agree on. And we saw Democrats and Republicans running on, like the economy, like infrastructure, about working families, about good jobs. There should be some progress, theoretically, that can be made during this time. And at the same time, we have to hold the president more accountable. I think the opportunity of the new majority in the House is to hopefully increase transparency and accountability when it comes to the president. That when they come out, whether it's a tweet in the morning or a terrible, ridiculous press conference, that there are members in the House who now have the ability and the authority to ask the questions and get them answered. That transparency and accountability, I think, is a much stronger path and a clearer path and a much stronger tool in the toolbox for Democrats heading into 2020 to be able to go home and talk about what they did at work this week. And I think that combination is one that will help get us through the daily madness.
And we're going to do our jobs. We're
Absolutely.
not going to go over it, but we have a job and responsibility of oversight. And we are going to do our jobs, because we can't just, forget about oversight, because then our folks will say, why did we elect you? They want there to be oversight of this president and this government. So we're going to do our jobs. Let me just add one other issue that I think is going to be big in the 2020 election, that generally, I know I've said it year after year, but now I think that it's come to the forefront. That's going to be the Supreme Court. That's going to be a big issue in 2020 and what individuals will be talking about, because before it's not an issue, you're not thinking about it, but with the court being where it is and the whole thing that took place with Kavanaugh and what took place with Obama, the blocking of his Supreme Court nominee, that is, and it has and the appointments of some of the federal judges on the lower levels, which will survive any presidency. That's going to be an issue that I think that the candidates will have to focus on our side to motivate folks and to let folks in the issues that are concerning people who are our Supreme Court justices and our federal court judges of a lifetime, because these are lifetime appointments. That's going to be a big issue in 2020.
As someone who started my baby lawyer career working on judicial nominations, I'm so excited that someone just said appellate nominees in a conversation like this, because that's definitely never happened before. We have time for maybe one more question. Yeah, right.
Hi, Elizabeth Morgan. Congressman, what might be the first couple of pieces of substantive legislation we'll see out of the House in 2019?
I think first it will be infrastructure. That's something that we think that we should be able to do and get done in a bipartisan manner, hopefully. There's a comprehensive infrastructure bill. I think we're going to be focused on that. And I think that also we're going to be focused on trying to make sure that we do put a bill together that gets cheaper prescription drugs and deals with health care, so that we can protect individuals who have pre-existing diseases, keep children on their parents' health care up to 26. We've got to focus on that, and we've got to firm that up, and we're going to send those bills out of the House to the Senate and see what they do with them, in a bipartisan manner. So I think those are two things that we will enact and work on immediately.
So I'm going to end us here, but I will say our pre-election poll that I referenced at the beginning of the discussion is actually going to be online today, so you are the first to hear about some of these results. But if you want to dig in more, you can go to thirdway.org. And thank you very much to our fantastic panel.
Thank you.